147 infected, standing motionless in the streets around our shelter. Not dead. Not alive in any way I understood. Frozen upright, with their eyes open, coated in ice, and every single one of them facing our building. The temperature was -41, and we thought the cold was protecting us. We thought winter was on our side. We were wrong, because one night, in the dead of winter, at temperatures where nothing should be able to move, they shifted position, just inches, just enough to tell us they weren't frozen at all. They were waiting, conserving. And the worst part, the part that still keeps me from sleeping, is what they did when we tried to leave. They didn't chase us. They didn't attack. They brought us firewood, stacked it 50 feet from our camp like a gift. And that's when I understood what we actually were to them. Not prey being hunted, livestock being managed, kept warm, kept alive, kept moving toward a place where the thaw would come first, and so would they. Let me tell you how it started. The thermometer read -41 the morning I found Corinne's body frozen to the window glass. Not leaning against it, fused to it. The moisture on her cheek had crystallized overnight and bonded skin to pain. And when I tried to move her, a strip of flesh stayed behind on the frost. I set her down carefully on the floor of what used to be the Garfield County Library's reading room and covered her face with my jacket. She'd been watching something outside when she died. I could tell by the angle of her neck, the way her hands were still raised slightly, palms forward, like she'd been trying to understand what she was seeing. I didn't look out that window. Not yet. That was day 97 of the winter, day 312 since the outbreak first swept through the mountain towns of western Colorado. And I want to tell you, if you'd asked me in September what would kill us, I would have said the infected. Every time. I would have said their speed, their numbers, the impossible way they moved through buildings like water finding cracks. I would have been wrong. The cold came in late October with no warning anyone trusted. No gradual descent. One week it was 50 degrees and raining. The next, the temperature plunged past 0 and kept falling like it had somewhere terrible to be. Within 3 days, the rain turned to ice, then to a dry, fine snow that didn't melt. Within 2 weeks, the diesel gelled in every vehicle we hadn't garaged. Within a month, the river froze solid enough to walk on, which meant the water intake for our little settlement's filtration system locked up and didn't thaw. My name is Orin Brask. I'm 51 years old. I was a long-haul freight dispatcher for 23 years before the collapse, coordinating loads between Denver and Grand Junction along the I-70 corridor. I knew every fuel stop, every way station, every elevation gain between those 2 points. I knew what cold did to infrastructure because I'd lost trucks to it. I'd seen jackknifed rigs on Vail Pass in November, watched fuel lines crack at Eisenhower Tunnel in January storms. I understood, in a practical way that most people didn't, that cold isn't just discomfort. Cold is systemic failure. Cold is the thing that makes every other thing stop working. None of that knowledge prepared me for what this winter did to us. We built something after the outbreak. Not large, 31 people at peak, clustered in the town of Silt, Colorado. Population 800 before everything fell apart. We'd cleared a 3-block perimeter, boarded windows, established watches. The infected had thinned out by August. Not gone, but manageable. They moved in smaller packs, slower, like the virus was burning through whatever fuel kept them upright. We thought we were entering the long recovery. We talked about spring planting. Harlan Dominguez, who'd been an agricultural extension agent, drew up crop rotation plans on butcher paper and pinned them to the library wall. Those plans were still hanging when Corinne froze to death 6 feet from the wood stove. The stove had gone out sometime around 3 in the morning. We later determined the flue had iced over a plug of frozen condensation that blocked the draw and let the fire suffocate on its own smoke. The temperature inside the library dropped from 60 degrees to below 0 in under 4 hours. I know this because Harlan had set up a thermometer with a min-max memory function, the kind greenhouse operators use. It recorded the low at -11 inside at 6:47 a.m. Corinne Vestal was 63. She'd been a dental hygienist in Rifle. She had a habit of reading aloud to herself not books, but handwritten lists. Grocery lists, task lists, lists of things she remembered about her daughter who died in the first week. She'd mutter them under her breath while she worked, and I'd hear her sometimes when I passed the sorting room. Eggs, flour, the blue dress she wore to prom, transmission fluid, 9mm, her laugh when she was startled. I never asked her about it. I wish I had. The morning I found her, the world outside had entered a phase none of us had language for. The snow wasn't falling. It was suspended. The air was so cold and so still that ice crystals hung motionless at head height, like walking through a room full of ground glass. Breathing without a wrap over your mouth meant ice forming inside your throat within minutes. I'd read about this phenomenon in accounts of Antarctic expeditions, diamond dust, they called it. But those were at the poles. We were at 39 degrees north latitude, elevation 5,000 feet. This wasn't supposed to happen here. I gathered the others that morning. 19 of us left, down from 31. The losses hadn't all been cold. Some left in November when a group decided to push south toward Montrose, convinced lower elevation meant warmer temperatures. We never heard from them again. 2 others were killed by infected who came stumbling out of a frozen drainage ditch in December, moving wrong, moving differently than before. I'll come back to that. We met in the library's basement, which stayed above freezing because of the geothermal vent that ran beneath the building's foundation, a warm spring that surfaced half a mile east and apparently ran under the old town center. It was the reason we'd chosen this building. Harlan had found it by noticing that the snow melted faster on the library's south side than anywhere else in town. We couldn't heat the whole building with it, but the basement stayed between 40 and 48 degrees, even on the worst nights. It's why I was alive. It's why any of us were. I told them about Corinne. I told them about the flu. Then I told them what I'd seen through the west-facing windows on my way downstairs. The thing I'd avoided looking at from the reading room. The infected were standing in the town square. Not moving, not hunting. Standing in rows, motionless, like fence posts driven into the snow. I counted 19 visible from the west windows. Their skin had gone the color of ash. Ice had formed on their surfaces, their shoulders, their skulls, the ridges of their knuckles giving them a crystalline coating that caught the thin morning light. They looked like statues, like monuments to something I didn't want to name. They hadn't been there the night before. Yael Ostroff was the first to speak. She was 44, former paramedic from Glenwood Springs, built like a distance runner with hands that never stopped moving. She'd sutured more wounds in the last 10 months than most ER docs see in a year. She asked the obvious question. Were they dead? I told her I didn't know. I told her they hadn't moved in the 20 minutes I'd watched. I told her their eyes were open. Phelan Cross, who'd been an electrician before and who now managed our generators and battery bank, said something I remember exactly. Frozen meat doesn't rot, Orin. It just waits. He was right. That was the part I hadn't wanted to say out loud. We knew the infected couldn't survive indefinitely without feeding. We'd watched them weaken over the summer and fall. Their biology, whatever the virus had rebuilt it into, still required caloric input. They ate, they consumed. When they couldn't find prey, they slowed and eventually collapsed. We'd found dozens of inert bodies in September and October, curled in basements and closets, dried out and still. But cold changes that equation. Cold is preservation. A body that should decompose and fail instead enters stasis. Every hunter knows this. Every freight dispatcher who's hauled frozen beef across the Rockies knows this. The infected weren't dying in the cold. They were being stored. The question wasn't whether they were dead. The question was, what happens when the temperature rises? We spent the next 3 days fortifying. Not against the cold this time, against what the cold was holding in place. Phelan and I did a circuit of our perimeter, counting. We found them everywhere. In doorways, in alleys, in the bed of a pickup truck on Main Street. Standing, sitting, crouching, all motionless, all rimed with frost, all with their eyes open. The final count was 147 within our 3-block zone. 147 infected, preserved like specimens in amber, waiting for a thaw that might or might not come. And we were living in their center. I need to go back further to explain what happened next. In December, before the deep freeze locked everything solid, we'd started noticing something about the infected that didn't match our earlier experience. The ones we encountered in cold weather moved differently. Not slower, you'd expect slower. They moved more deliberately, more coordinated. In warmer months, they were chaos. They charged, they swarmed. They responded to sound and motion like predators keying on prey stimulus. Pure reaction. But the cold ones, the ones we encountered at temperatures below zero, they behaved differently. They flanked. They waited. One night in early December, 2 of them herded a deer toward a third that was crouching behind a snowbank. I watched it from the second-floor window of the library with Harlan beside me. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "That's cooperative hunting." I'd seen wolves do exactly that on nature documentaries. I'd never seen the infected do anything except charge. Yael had a theory. She said extreme cold might be forcing the virus to conserve energy, and in doing so, it was suppressing the frantic aggression that characterized warm weather infected behavior. What replaced it was something worse. Patience, strategy, a predator that's too cold to sprint but too hungry to stop, and smart enough to know the difference. We tested it in small ways. We set noise traps cans on strings at various points around the perimeter and monitored which direction the cold weather infected approached from. In warm months, they would have run straight at the sound. In December, they circled. They approached from downwind. They waited until the sound repeated to confirm its location before advancing. If you're listening to this and wondering what you would have done differently, whether you'd have left or stayed, fortified or run, I'll tell you that the answer changes every time you have new information. And we were getting new information every week that winter that made the previous week's plan obsolete. If these kinds of stories keep you thinking, stay subscribed. There's more to tell. Now let me get back to what happened after we counted the frozen ones. Day 100, 3 days after finding Corinne. The temperature had stabilized at minus 38. Our diesel generator had failed on day 94, which meant our power came exclusively from Phelan's battery bank. 16 deep cycle marine batteries he'd salvaged from RV dealerships along the highway, charged by a small wind turbine he'd mounted on the library roof. The turbine was rated for 30-mile-per-hour winds, and the wind that week was steady at 15, which gave us enough power to run LED lighting in the basement, charge radios, and keep the medical refrigerator alive. Nothing else. No electric heating, no cooking, We cooked over the wood stove when the flue was clear, or over a propane camp stove that was eating through our tanks faster than I wanted to calculate. Water was the immediate crisis. With the river frozen and our filtration system dead, we were melting snow. Melting snow requires heat. Heat requires fuel. Fuel was finite and disappearing. This is the arithmetic of winter survival that most people don't think about until it's killing them. Water and warmth are the same resource. I assigned shifts. 2 people on snow melt duty at all times, maintaining a rotation of pots over the wood stove and camp stove. We needed roughly 2 gallons per person per day for drinking and basic hygiene. 19 people, 38 gallons. Melting snow yields roughly 1/10 its volume in water. We needed to melt 380 gallons of snow daily. That's an absurd volume. We weren't hitting it. People were dehydrated. Yael could see it in their skin, their urine color, the headaches that wouldn't stop. Day 103. I made the decision to send a team to the hot spring. The geothermal vent that warmed our basement surfaced half a mile east at what used to be a small spa resort. Before the collapse, it was a tourist spot. Mineral baths, hiking trails, a gift shop selling turquoise jewelry. The spring itself was hot enough to remain liquid even in this cold. If we could establish a water run teams carrying containers to the spring and back, we could solve the water problem without burning fuel to melt snow. Half a mile. In normal conditions, a 10-minute walk. In minus 38 with diamond dust in the air, and 147 frozen infected standing between us and the spring like a field of landmines that might or might not be armed. I chose 3 people for the first run. Myself, Phelan, because he was the strongest and calmest under strange pressure, and a woman named Dagna Leitner, 41, former long-distance truck driver she'd driven for the same freight company I dispatched for, though we'd never met before the collapse. She knew cold. She knew endurance. She didn't panic. We suited up in every layer we had. I wore a base layer of merino wool, 2 fleece mid-layers, a down jacket, and an outer shell rated for mountaineering. 3 pairs of socks, insulated boots with chemical toe warmers stuffed inside, balaclava under a fleece neck gaiter under the hood, ski goggles, 2 pairs of gloves, thin liners under heavy mittens. We each carried 2 5-gallon jerry cans, empty for the walk out, full for the walk back. And we each carried a weapon. I had a 12-gauge pump shotgun. Phelan had a hunting rifle, bolt action, .308. Dagna had a hatchet and a Glock 19. We left at 10 in the morning, when the sun was highest and the temperature might be 2 degrees warmer than overnight. The moment we stepped outside, my goggles fogged, then froze. I had to wipe them with my mitten every 30 seconds. My first breath through the gaiter turned to ice on the fabric and sealed against my mouth. I ripped it down and breathed through my nose, feeling the hairs freeze instantly, the mucous membranes sting like I'd inhaled glass. The first frozen infected was 40 feet from our door. A woman, or what used to be one. She was standing in the middle of the sidewalk, arms slightly raised, head tilted at an angle that suggested she'd been turning when the cold locked her in place. Ice coated her like lacquer. Her eyes were open, clouded white, and absolutely still. We walked past her within arm's reach. Nothing. Not a twitch. Not a sound. I watched Phelan's breath plume as he passed her. Watched the vapor drift across her face. Nothing. The second was in the intersection of Main and 3rd. A male, large, maybe 240 pounds in life, now coated in a shell of rime that made him look carved from salt. His mouth was open. His teeth were visible. I could see that 2 of his molars were missing. We passed 23 of them in the walk to the spring, each one motionless, each one terrifying in a specific way that I couldn't have predicted. It wasn't their stillness that scared me. It was the recognition that they had chosen these positions. They hadn't collapsed randomly. They'd been standing, facing, oriented towards something when the cold took them. They were arranged, not in formation exactly, but with purpose. Like they'd been walking somewhere together, and the cold had flash frozen them mid-stride. Toward us. Most of them were facing toward the library. We reached the spring at 10:40 a.m. The resort buildings were destroyed, collapsed under snow weight, gutted by fire months earlier. But the spring itself was alive, steaming in the frozen air, a pool of dark water rimmed by ice shelves and mineral deposits that glowed orange and sulfur yellow. The temperature near the water was noticeably warmer, maybe 10 above zero. Still brutal, but the difference from -38 felt like stepping into a heated room. We filled our cans. The water was hot, maybe 110 degrees at the source. It steamed and hissed when the wind hit it. We'd need to let it cool before drinking, but the mineral content was something Yael would need to assess. We filled all 6 cans, which meant 50 pounds per person on the walk back. Dagna spotted them first. She didn't shout. She tapped my shoulder twice and pointed northwest toward the tree line above the resort. They were infected in the trees, not frozen, moving, slowly, deliberately, with that patient coordination we'd observed in December. They were above us on the slope, weaving between the trunks of bare aspens, and they were watching us. I counted 8 before I stopped counting and focused on the path back. These weren't the frozen statues in town. These were active, cold-adapted hunters. We walked, not ran running in that cold, carrying 50 pounds of water in snow that deep would mean cardiac overload within minutes. We walked at the fastest sustainable pace I could manage, and I listened. Behind us, the sound of movement through snow, crunching, rhythmic, following but not closing. They kept pace with us for the first quarter mile. Then they began to spread. I could hear them on both flanks now, left side in the drainage ditch behind the old gas station. Right side moving through the parking lot of the defunct Dollar General. Flanking, the same behavior we'd seen in December. I stopped, turned, raised the shotgun. And I did something I'd read about in a book on wolf deterrence years before. I made myself large and loud. I shouted. Not words, just noise. A roar that tore my throat in the frozen air. They stopped. All of them simultaneously, like a signal had been sent. They stood in their positions, motionless, watching from maybe 80 yards out. Not attacking, not retreating. We backed away, slowly, eyes on them, all the way to the library perimeter. They didn't follow past the gas station, back inside, in the basement, warming our hands on the cans of hot spring water. I told the others what we'd seen. The frozen ones in town hadn't moved. But the ones near the spring were active, hunting, and intelligent enough to test us without committing to an attack. Harlan looked at me across the folding table and said, "They're not all frozen, just the ones that want to be." I didn't understand what he meant for another 2 weeks. Day 109. We'd established a water run schedule twice daily, always in groups of 3, always armed, always loud on the return trip. The active infected near the spring never attacked, but they never left either. They watched. They followed at a distance. They tested our edges the way a predator tests fence wire. Pressure, retreat, pressure again, looking for the one day the fence gives. Inside the library, the cold was grinding us down in ways weapons couldn't fix. Yael treated 4 cases of frostbite in the first week of January. Phelan lost the tip of his left ring finger, turned black and hard before he even felt it. A man named Crawford Thaw, 67, former rancher from Parachute, developed a cough that wouldn't clear, and within 10 days was spitting blood. Pneumonia. In a warm hospital with antibiotics, it's treatable. In a frozen library basement with expired over-the-counter medication, it's a death sentence. Crawford died on day 115. The day he died, the temperature rose to -20, a heat wave by our standards. And something happened that still puts ice in my spine. 3 of the frozen infected in the town square moved. Not much, not full reanimation, but their fingers twitched, their heads turned by degrees. I was watching from the second floor when it happened. One of them, a tall male in a shredded postal worker's uniform, shifted his weight from his left foot to his right. Just that. A single adjustment. Then the temperature dropped again that evening, and they locked back into stillness. I went downstairs and found Harlan. I told him what I'd seen. He nodded as if he'd expected it. "They're thermoregulating," he said. "The virus doesn't die in cold. It adapts, slows metabolism to near zero, preserves muscle glycogen, prevents ice crystal damage. Somehow maybe it produces its own antifreeze proteins, like Arctic fish. When the temperature rises even slightly, they test their range of motion. They're not frozen, Orin. They're hibernating." Hibernating. 147 infected, standing among our buildings inside our perimeter, hibernating within arm's reach of where we slept. "What happens in spring?" I asked. Harlan didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night I lay in my sleeping bag in the basement and did the math I'd been avoiding. Our town had seen maybe 200 infected in the entire outbreak period from March through October. We'd killed or seen collapse maybe 50. 50 to 60 had migrated away or simply disappeared. That left roughly 100 unaccounted for. But we'd counted 147 frozen in our perimeter alone. More than should have been there. They'd come during the cold. While we thought winter was protecting us, they'd been walking in from surrounding areas, gathering, drawn by something, our heat, our sounds, our activity. They'd been collecting around us in the dark and cold like iron filings around a magnet, and the cold had frozen them in place before they reached us. We weren't fortified. We were surrounded. We were the center of a closing circle that the cold had paused but not stopped. I brought this to the group on day 112. The argument that followed was the worst we'd had since October. Dagna wanted to leave immediately. "South," she said. "Anywhere south. Load the 2 vehicles that still had fuel and drive until we hit pavement that wasn't iced." She argued that staying meant waiting for the thaw to kill us. She was right about the math. Phelan argued we couldn't leave. The 2 vehicles, a Ford F350 with a diesel engine and a Subaru Outback with a quarter tank, couldn't carry 19 people. And even if they could, the roads were impassable. I-70 had been drifted shut since November. The passes were under 20 feet of snow. The only clear route was the river valley bottom toward Grand Junction. And that ran directly through territory we hadn't scouted in months. Yael stayed quiet for most of it, then said, "We can't drive out, and we can't stay through the thaw. So we need to reduce the number before spring." She meant kill the frozen ones. Go out with weapons and destroy them while they were stationary. Simple, brutal, logical. I was the one who said no. Not because I had moral objections to destroying infected. I'd killed dozens by then, in self-defense and in clearance operations. I said no because of what I'd observed at the hot spring. The active ones, the smart ones. They watched us, they tested us, and they hadn't attacked. What if killing the frozen ones provokes the active ones? I said. What if the frozen ones are connected to them somehow? A network, a colony. What if the 147 in our perimeter are the colony's reserves, and the 8 to 12 active ones near the spring are its scouts? You destroy the reserves, the scouts attack. Silence. Nobody had a counter-argument because nobody understood what the cold had turned the infected into. We were making decisions based on summer rules applied to a winter enemy, and the rules no longer fit. We compromised. We'd reduce, carefully, 1 per day, starting at the perimeter edges, working inward. Watch for response from the active ones. If the active group changed behavior, increased aggression, moved closer, attacked, we'd stop. Day 113. Phelan and I went out at midday with a pry bar and the shotgun. We approached the nearest frozen infected jar. That's the woman on the sidewalk 40 feet from our door. She hadn't moved. Her eyes were still clouded white. Ice still sealed her to the concrete, where her shoes had melted with the frozen slush beneath them. Phelan struck her in the temple with the pry bar. The sound was unlike anything I'd expected. Not the wet impact of living tissue, but a sharp, crystalline crack, like striking a block of ice with a chisel. Her skull fractured along frozen stress lines. She didn't bleed. The blood inside her was frozen solid. She fell in one piece, rigid, like a mannequin toppling. We waited. Watched the others. Watched the tree line. Nothing moved. Day 114, another one. Same result. Day 115. Crawford died, and we destroyed 2 that day out of something close to rage. Day 116, 2 more. By day 120, we'd eliminated 11. The active ones near the spring hadn't changed behavior during our water runs. No increase in aggression, no closer approach. On day 121, I noticed something that stopped the operation. The frozen ones had shifted. Not all of them, but several, maybe a dozen, had changed position overnight. Slightly. A turned head. A foot moved 6 inches. An arm raised that hadn't been raised before. The temperature hadn't risen. It was still minus 35. They shouldn't have been able to move at all. I checked the thermometer logs. No warming event. No temperature spike in the night. They'd moved at minus 35. Harlan couldn't explain it. Neither could Yael. But Phelan could. He came to me that afternoon with a temperature probe he'd built from a meat thermometer and a long wire. He'd gone out early and held the probe against the chest of one of the frozen infected in the alley behind the library. Their internal temperature was 14 degrees warmer than the ambient air. At minus 35 outside, their cores were registering minus 21. Something inside them was generating heat. Not much. Not enough to melt the ice on their surfaces, but enough to keep their deepest tissues above the temperature at which muscle fiber becomes truly immovable. They weren't frozen. Harlan had been right all along. They were waiting, conserving, generating just enough metabolic heat to maintain the option of movement. And our killing 11 of them hadn't gone unnoticed. The slight repositioning was a response. They were adjusting, tightening the circle by fractions of an inch. I called off the elimination immediately. That night, I sat with Harlan in the basement, drinking hot spring water that tasted like copper and sulfur. And I asked him the question I'd been afraid to form. Do you think they're intelligent? Actually intelligent? Harlan was 61, weathered, thoughtful. the kind of man who didn't answer until he'd considered every angle. He sipped his water and said, "I think the virus is intelligent. I think the cold forced it to solve a problem how to preserve its hosts while resources are scarce. And solving that problem required a level of coordination that looks like intelligence from the outside. Whether there's awareness behind it." He shook his head. "Doesn't matter to us either way." He was right. From a survival standpoint, the distinction between intelligent enemies and enemies that behave identically to intelligent ones is academic. Day 130. The temperature rose to -15, a substantial warming. And the frozen ones came alive. Not all at once, not dramatically. It happened over the course of a single afternoon between noon and 4 p.m. A slight rocking, weight shifts, heads turning more fully, fingers opening and closing, mouths working, though no sound came out. By 4 p.m., several on the outer edge of the group had taken full steps. We were in lockdown. Every door barricaded, every window shuttered. 19 people in the basement, weapons ready, listening to the silence above. Nothing happened. By evening, the temperature dropped back to -30, and the movement stopped. But the positions had changed. After that afternoon, the frozen ones were 6 to 8 feet closer to the library on average. Every one of them. I want you to understand something about psychological survival in conditions like this. Every day we went to sleep knowing that 136 frozen infected stood within our perimeter. Each one slightly closer than the day before, each one warmer inside than the air suggested, each one waiting for a sustained thaw to finish whatever approach they'd been making since November. We couldn't leave. We couldn't fight them all. We couldn't outrun them. We existed inside a slowly contracting circle of suspended predators. And the only thing preventing our death was a temperature we couldn't control. That is not a military problem. It's not a tactical problem. It's a psychological problem. And it broke some of us on day 138. A man named Rennick Pace 38, former ski patroller, strong, capable. Someone I'd trusted completely walked out the front door at 2 in the morning without telling anyone. He had no weapon, no coat. He walked into the middle of the frozen infected in the square and sat down cross-legged in the snow. We found him at dawn. He was alive barely, hypothermic, delirious. The frozen ones hadn't touched him. They stood around him in their static positions, and he sat in their center like a child in a sculpture garden, murmuring words none of us could understand. Yael brought him in and warmed him over 3 hours. When he could talk, I asked him why. "I needed to know if they'd take me," he said. "I needed to know if it would be quick." He was checking, testing the exit, measuring the cost of giving up against the cost of continuing. I'd seen that math before. I'd seen it in dispatch drivers who worked too many hours in too much cold and started making errors that weren't really errors. Rennick wasn't crazy. He was exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't fix. Day 145. I made the hardest decision of my life since the outbreak began. We had to go. Not drive, the vehicles were dead, batteries frozen, diesel gelled past saving. Walk. 19 people on foot through -30 temperatures, carrying what we could on our backs, heading east toward the canyon country where the geothermal activity was stronger, where the ground temperature might keep a cave or a hot spring valley above freezing without fuel or infrastructure, or we could stay and wait for the thaw. And when it came, whether in February or March or April, 136 infected would complete their approach in minutes. We'd be overwhelmed before we could reach the back door. Dagna was the one who laid out the route. east along the Colorado River Valley, then south into the canyon system toward Glenwood Springs. She knew a network of hot springs in the backcountry, not tourist developed, not on most maps. Natural thermal vents in narrow canyons where the rock stayed warm year-round. Defensible, remote, and most critically, warm enough to survive without burning fuel we didn't have. It was 18 miles. In summer, a hard day's hike. In this cold, with this terrain, carrying supplies, with active infected roaming the surrounding area, it was probably 2 days. 2 nights exposed. We voted, 14 in favor of leaving, 3 against, 2 abstained. Rennick voted to leave. Harlan voted against. He said his knees wouldn't make it 18 miles in the cold, and he was probably right. I told him he was coming anyway. I told him I'd carry him on my back if I had to. He looked at me with something between gratitude and pity and said, "Orin, I'm 61 years old with arthritic knees and the beginnings of what I suspect is congestive heart failure. If I slow the group down, you leave me. Agreed?" I didn't agree. I didn't argue either. I just started packing. Day 147, departure. We left at first light. 19 people in a column, breath pluming in the dark blue of early morning. Each person carried a pack with sleeping bag, water, food for 3 days, and whatever personal items they couldn't leave behind. I carried the shotgun, 50 shells, a first aid kit, and Harlan's crop rotation plans rolled up in a cardboard tube. He hadn't asked me to bring them. I took them anyway. The route out of Silt took us directly through the western edge of the frozen perimeter. We couldn't avoid them. They stood in the streets and alleys, like posts in a maze. We'd plotted a path that kept maximum distance from each one, never closer than 15 feet. But in places where they'd clustered, that was impossible. We walked between them. 19 living people threading through 136 frozen ones. I could have reached out and touched them. I could see the individual ice crystals on their skin, the frost in their open mouths, the stillness of their clouded eyes. Phelan was behind me. I heard his breathing fast, controlled, the breathing of a man keeping panic on a leash. Nobody made a sound. Nobody brushed against them. Nobody tripped. It took 40 minutes to clear the perimeter. 40 minutes of walking among the dead not dead, step by careful step, in silence so complete I could hear the creak of my own pack straps. Then we were past them. Open road, open snow, open cold. The first 3 hours were the hardest. The wind came up around 9 a.m. 15 miles per hour, enough to drop the wind chill past 50 below. Exposed skin frostbitten in under 2 minutes at that temperature. We stopped twice to rewrap faces, check extremities, redistribute weight from people struggling. Harlan was limping by mile 2, but keeping pace through what I suspected was pure stubbornness, and carefully rationed ibuprofen. I kept us on the river road, Route 6, paralleling the Colorado River, which was a frozen white highway beside us. The road itself was buried under 2 feet of packed snow, but the route was level and the landmarks were visible. Bridges, buildings, mile markers sticking up through the drifts. At mile 4, Dagna pointed southeast, movement on the ridge above the river. I raised binoculars and saw them. A group of active infected, moving parallel to us, keeping pace on the high ground. 8, maybe 10. The same ones from near the spring, or others impossible to tell at that distance. They didn't approach. They watched. They paced. This continued for 3 hours. They maintained distance maybe 300 yards above and to the right, and matched our speed exactly. Scouts, outriders, the colony tracking its departing prey. If you've ever been watched by something that could kill you, Something that knows exactly where you are and is choosing not to attack yet. You understand the specific quality of that fear. It's not panic, it's weight. It sits on your chest and makes every breath cost more. At mile 7, we reached the old rest stop at Canyon Creek. I called a halt. People needed water, food, rest. 20 minutes. No longer. Harlan collapsed onto a snow-covered picnic bench and didn't move. Yael checked his pulse, his pupils, his color. She pulled me aside. His heart rate is irregular. He's hypothermic despite the layers. His extremities are gray. Can he make 11 more miles? She looked at me without expression. That was her answer. I went to him, sat beside him. The bench was so cold through my layers that I felt it in my hip bones. I said, "Harlan, talk to me." He opened his eyes. They were clear, focused, not the eyes of a man giving up. "I can make it to the canyon," he said, "if someone carries my pack from here." I took his pack, added it to my own. 75 pounds total on my back now, plus the shotgun and shells. My knees protested. My lower back lit up with a pain I knew would get worse before it got better. We moved. Mile 9. The infected on the ridge had been joined by others. I counted 16 now. Still not approaching, still pacing. Mile 10. The terrain changed. The river cut through narrower canyon walls, and the road climbed slightly as it followed the curve. Steeper ground, harder walking. Harlan was using Phelan's shoulder as a crutch, the two of them moving as a single lurching unit. Mile 12. The sun was getting low. We had maybe 2 hours of light left and 6 miles to go. We wouldn't make it before dark. I made the call. We'd shelter for the night at mile 13, at the Grizzly Creek rest area where a tunnel entrance would provide wind protection and some retained ground heat from the deep rock. We reached it at 4:30 p.m. The tunnel was a short one, maybe 200 yards of I-70 bored through the canyon wall. Both ends were drifted with snow, but the center was clear, dry, and blocked from wind. The temperature inside was only -10, substantially warmer than outside. We packed in, set up sleeping bags, and I posted watches at both tunnel mouths. This is where everything changed. And I want you to understand, if you're still with me, what happened next is the reason I'm recording this. Not for entertainment, because people need to know what the cold did, what it made them become. The watches reported quiet through the sunset, say. The infected on the ridge had stopped when we stopped, settling into the tree line above the tunnel's eastern entrance. Visible, present, still not approaching. At 9 p.m., the temperature dropped past -40 again. The wind died completely. Diamond dust filled the air outside the tunnel mouths, and visibility dropped to 20 feet. At 10:15 p.m., Dagna on Eastern Watch came to wake me. Her face was rigid, not scared. Something else. Confused. "They're coming down," she whispered, slowly, walking down the slope toward the tunnel entrance. "But Orin, they're carrying something." I grabbed the shotgun and followed her to the eastern mouth. In the crystalline darkness, visible only by the faint reflected glow of our single lantern, I could see them, the infected, coming down the slope in a line, moving at walking pace. And each one was carrying branches, dead wood, armloads of broken timber from the ridge trees. They walked to within 50 feet of the tunnel entrance. Then they stopped, and one by one, they set down the wood, stacked it, deliberately, carefully, a pile that grew to 4 feet high, then 5. Then they retreated back up the slope and disappeared into the tree line. I stood there with the shotgun raised, finger on the trigger guard. For 15 minutes. Nothing else moved. The pile of wood sat in the snow like an offering. It was firewood. They'd brought us firewood. I did not sleep that night. I sat against the tunnel wall with a shotgun across my knees, and I tried to construct a framework in which what I'd seen made sense. The virus was preserving its hosts. The cold had forced it toward efficiency, coordination, intelligence. It tracked us. It surrounded us. It waited for us. And now, it was keeping us alive. Why? Harlan was awake beside me. He'd seen it too. At 2 a.m., in the darkness of the tunnel, with 16 sleeping people around us, he said quietly, "They don't want us dead, Orin. They want us warm." "Why?" I said. "What does a colony need when the freeze ends?" he said. "When 136 preserved units wake up hungry, what do they need immediately?" Food. Nearby. Contained. Warm-blooded. We weren't surrounded. We weren't being tracked. We were being herded, kept alive, maintained. Oh, like livestock being guided toward a slaughter that hadn't happened yet, because the timing wasn't right. The colony, because that's what it was. A colony, a superorganism directed by the virus's cold-adapted intelligence, had solved a winter problem. How do you preserve your food supply when the cold preserves you, but also preserves your prey beyond your reach? Answer: you keep the prey mobile. Guide them. Remove obstacles. Provide resources. Let them move to a location you can access when the thaw comes. The hot springs where the thaw would come first. We were walking exactly where they wanted us to go. Dawn, day 148. I gathered everyone in the tunnel center and told them what Harlan and I had concluded. The reaction was what you'd expect. Disbelief, terror, then a cold, calculating silence as 17 people tried to think their way out of a trap that might extend for 18 miles in every direction. Dagna asked the practical question, do we go back? Back to Silt? To the frozen circle that was probably already adjusting to our absence? Back to a library with a dead generator and dwindling fuel? Phelan asked, do we go forward knowing they want us there? Forward to the hot springs, to warmth, to survival until the thaw. The third option was the one nobody wanted to say. We go somewhere they don't expect, off route, off plan, into the canyon country without a thermal destination, into cold that would kill us within 2 days without shelter. I chose the fourth option. We go forward to the hot springs because that's where we survive winter. And we prepare, right now, for the thaw. We turn their trap into our fortress before the temperature rises. 6 more miles. We walked them in 4 hours, and the infected walked with us above, flanking, never approaching, never threatening. They melted into the canyon walls when we reached the narrow valley where the thermal vents surfaced. Steam rose from the rocks. The air was warm, genuinely warm, maybe 45 degrees in the sheltered canyon. Hot water pooled in natural basins. The rock walls were defensible, one narrow entrance to the south, sheer cliffs on all other sides. We'd arrived at exactly where the colony wanted us, and I intended to make them regret it. Ask yourself what you'd have done in that canyon, knowing what was coming with the thaw. Ask yourself what's worth fighting for when the enemy might already be smarter than you. If you ever want to tell me your answer, leave it below. Now let me tell you what we built. 27 days. That's what we had before the thaw hit. 27 days in a warm canyon with hot water, defensible walls, an absolute certainty that when temperatures rose above freezing, 136 reanimated infected, plus the 16 active scouts, would converge on our position. We built. Not a bunker, not a wall, a kill zone. Phelan designed it. He'd worked electrical for 15 years, but before that, he'd spent 4 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. He knew field fortifications. He knew how to channel movement. The canyon entrance was 12 feet wide. We narrowed it to 4 using boulders rolled from the cliff base, work that took 8 people 7 days in conditions that would have been impossible without the canyon's warmth. 4 feet wide. One person could defend that with a shotgun for a long time. Behind the gap, we dug a trench 3 feet deep, sharp staked at the bottom with fire-hardened branches. Anything that made it through the gap fell into the trench. Behind the trench, a second barrier of stacked rock, chest high. Behind that, the main living area where the springs surfaced and the warmth was strongest. We prepared weapons, sharpened every blade we had, rationed ammunition. We had 93 shotgun shells, 42 rifle rounds, and 3 full magazines for the Glock. We made spears from metal fence posts. We made fire always fire, burning at the entrance, because the infected had avoided open flame even in summer. Harlan didn't help build. He couldn't. His condition worsened in the canyon better warmth, but something in his chest was failing regardless. Yael kept him comfortable. He spent his days sitting near the largest hot pool, wrapped in a sleeping bag, watching the steam rise and making notes on his crop plans. He'd pull the rolled papers from the cardboard tube, make adjustments with a pencil stub, then roll them up again. Potatoes in the south field, beans along the east fence, corn in the center plot, Three Sisters method, planning for a world that might not need his plans. Day 161. I sat with him while the others worked on the barrier. He was thin. His breathing was wrong, too fast, too shallow, with a wet quality underneath. "You know why I voted against leaving Silt," he said. "Your knees." "My knees are fine. They hurt, but they work." He paused. "I voted against it because I thought the frozen ones were beautiful." I looked at him. Not beautiful not aesthetically. Beautiful like a solution is beautiful. 136 organisms, coordinated without language, solving a problem no individual could solve. Hibernating in place, generating just enough heat to preserve function. The virus found an answer to winter that took mammals millions of years of evolution. It found it in months. He coughed wet, deep. I spent my career trying to understand how ecosystems adapt. This is adaptation at a scale I never imagined possible. I wanted to stay and study it. "It wants to eat us, Harlan." "Yes, and I want to eat corn." "That doesn't make corn less magnificent." He died 4 days later, quietly, in the night, beside the hot spring. Yael found him at dawn with his hand still resting on the cardboard tube of crop plans. I didn't bury him. The ground was too hard outside the canyon and too wet inside. We wrapped him in his sleeping bag and carried him to a high ledge above the springs where the heat rose and the steam would preserve him or dissolve him depending on conditions. It felt wrong either way. Everything about death felt wrong in this new world. The rituals we had for it were designed for a time when death was rare and individual. Now it was common and systemic, and the old forms didn't fit. 18 people left. Day 175, the thaw. It didn't come gradually. It came in a wave. On day 174, the temperature was -20. On day 175, it was 12 above, a 40-degree swing in 24 hours. Weather systems that made no sense by old rules, driven by atmospheric disruption that scientists would probably have a name for if any of them were alive to study it. We heard them before we saw them. A sound from the canyon entrance, from beyond the canyon, from the valley floor that I can only describe as mass thawing. The sound of 136 bodies cracking free of ice simultaneously. Pops and snaps, and a long, groaning creak of tissue expanding back to functional temperature. Then movement, a lot of movement. Coming from the south through the canyon approach, exactly as predicted. I was at the gap, shotgun loaded. Phelan beside me with the rifle. Dagna behind the barrier with the Glock and 3 people with spears. Everyone else further back with improvised weapons, hatchets, hammers, metal stakes. They appeared at the canyon mouth in a mass. Not running, walking, coordinated. A column 4 abreast the width that the original canyon entrance would have permitted before we narrowed it. They expected the width to be as it was. They didn't know about the gap. The first 4 hit the narrowing point and compressed. For a moment, maybe 3 seconds, they tangled against each other at the 4-foot gap. I fired. At that range, the shotgun was devastating. The first 2 dropped. The third pushed through, fell into the trench, impaled on the stakes below. The 4th came at me over its falling companions, and I fired again, point blank, and it came apart. Then more. Wave after wave feeding into the 4-foot funnel. Phelan firing over my shoulder, picking targets at the back of the column, trying to create a pile at the entrance that would block further approach. Dagna firing past me at anything that cleared the trench. It worked. For 20 minutes, it worked perfectly. The gap bottlenecked them exactly as Phelan had designed. They couldn't use their numbers. They couldn't flank. They died in the funnel 4 at a time, piling up, creating their own barrier. Then the scouts, the smart ones, the cold-adapted hunters who'd watched us for months, came over the canyon wall. They'd climbed. I didn't know they could climb sheer rock, but the cold had given them patience, and the virus had given them grip. And they came over the north cliff like spiders, silently, while we were focused on the gap. Rennick saw them first. He shouted the first sound other than gunfire in minutes. And then they were among us. 6 of them, dropping from the cliff face into our living area. Moving with that terrible winter intelligence, targeting specific people, isolating them, pulling them away from the group. What followed was 10 minutes of close quarters chaos that I will not describe in detail because some of it is still unclear in my memory, and some of it I don't want clear. We lost 4 people. Rennick was one of them. A woman named Sabine, whose last name I never learned, was another. 2 others whose faces I can see, but whose names I can't bring to voice right now. We killed the 6 scouts, every one of them. And when the gap finally clogged with bodies to the point that no more could push through 30, maybe 40 dead in the funnel and trench the ones behind, stopped coming. They stood at the canyon mouth, maybe 40 still standing, and they waited. Then, as the sun dropped and the temperature began falling again, back toward 0, back toward freezing, they turned. And they walked away. Not fled, walked, deliberately, back toward the valley. We held the canyon. 14 people, bleeding, exhausted, standing in a charnel space that stank of burnt gunpowder and things I don't have words for. We held it. The cold came back that night. -10, -15. The remaining infected would freeze again somewhere in the valley if they hadn't dissolved back into the landscape to wait for the next thaw, the next attempt, the next test of our defenses. Or maybe they wouldn't come back. Maybe the colony had decided the cost was too high. Maybe it would find easier prey elsewhere. Maybe, and this is what I believed in that moment, standing in the aftermath with the shotgun empty and my hands shaking so badly I couldn't reload. Maybe we'd proven something to whatever intelligence coordinated them, that we were too expensive to consume. That was 3 weeks ago. The temperature has fluctuated since then. 3 more short thaws, each one a day or two of warmth before the cold returns. Each time, we go to the gap and wait. Each time, nothing comes. Yal says the weather pattern is breaking. That real spring sustained warmth, not these oscillating waves, will come within a month. When it does, the frozen ones across the region will all reanimate at once. Not just ours. All of them. Every infected that the winter preserved from here to the Continental Divide. We have 14 people, 41 shotgun shells, 8 rifle rounds, and a defensible canyon with hot water and steep walls. We have Harlan's crop plans, which I unrolled last night and studied by lantern light. Potatoes in the south field, beans along the east fence, corn in the center. The canyon has soil in its lower terraces, alluvial deposits from ancient floods. We have seeds that Dagna carried from Silt in the bottom of her pack, wrapped in plastic next to her spare ammunition. We can't go back. We can't go forward into territory saturated with thawing infected. We can only hold this canyon, grow what we can in its warm soil, defend its single entrance, and wait. The winter changed everything. It changed the infected, made them smarter, more coordinated, more patient. It changed the land, made distance lethal, made movement a death sentence, made shelter the only option, and then made shelter into a trap. And it changed us. It taught us that survival isn't about being strong enough to fight or fast enough to run. It's about being stubborn enough to adapt faster than the thing trying to kill you. Harlan was right about one thing. The virus found a solution to winter. It adapted in months what took mammals millions of years. But so did we. 14 people in a canyon with hot springs, growing food in volcanic soil, defending a 4-foot gap with dwindling ammunition and sharpened metal. That's adaptation too. That's evolution happening in real time, not of the body, but of the will. The temperature tonight is -8 and falling. The wind carries diamond dust through the canyon entrance and into our camp, where it settles on our sleeping bags and our weapons and the rolled up crop plans that I keep in their cardboard tube beside my shotgun. Spring is coming. We'll be here when it arrives. Whether that's a victory or a delayed sentence, I won't know until the ice breaks for good. But I know this. The colony spent all winter trying to keep us alive for slaughter. And we're still alive. And we're not livestock. We're the thing that survived the winter too. And we learned from it, just like they did. Let them thaw. We'll be ready.